The chapel in St. Louis smelled of beeswax candles and old hymnals, the kind of smell that had soaked into Hannah Mae Brennan's lungs since she was old enough to kneel beside her father at the altar. She knelt now in the front pew, her gloved hands clasped so tightly the leather creaked, her forehead pressed against her interlocked fingers. The morning light came through the stained glass in long ribbons of red and blue and gold, painting the wooden floorboards in colors that seemed too rich for a Tuesday in October. She was 24 years old. She had a leather satchel at her feet that contained a stolen ledger, a tintype photograph of three brothers she had never met, a marriage contract signed in her own careful hand, and $72 in folded greenback notes. She had a one-way ticket on the Northern Pacific Railway, tucked inside the cover of her mother's old Bible. She had no living family. No one would notice she was gone until the bank manager found the empty chair behind her desk on Monday morning. She had a plan that had taken 3 months to build brick by careful brick in the quiet hours after her shift at the Helena Territorial Bank. Lord, she whispered into the empty chapel, her breath clouding in the cold air. I am about to tell a lie that will become the truth. I am about to marry 3 men I have never seen. I am about to disappear from the only city I've ever known. If this is wrong, give me a sign now and I will lay this satchel down and walk away. If this is the work you set before me, then please, please do not let me lose my nerve before the train pulls out of the station. She waited, the candles guttered. Somewhere in the rafters, a sparrow shifted on its perch. The Christ above the altar looked down with the same weary patience he had worn on the day her father had baptized her in the Mississippi when she was 7 years old. No sign came. Or perhaps the sign was the silence itself, the absence of any voice telling her to stop. Hannah Mae rose smooth the front of her emerald green riding habit, picked up the satchel, and walked out of the chapel into the bright, cold morning. The bells of the cathedral down the street began to toll the hour. By the time the 8th chime faded, she was walking toward Union Station, her heels clicking against the cobblestones, her breath plumes of white in the October air. She did not look back. She had been taught by her father, the late Reverend Ezekiel Brennan, that Lot's wife was a warning, written in salt for everyone who came after. The crack of the Winchester did not echo. The heavy Bitterroot snow swallowed it whole. Hannah Mae was sprinting through the dense pines, her breath tearing from her lungs in ragged white plumes when the second shot rang out and the heavy lead tore into her back. She plummeted forward, but the frozen earth never claimed her. Strong, leather-clad arms snatched her from the air, pulling her into the shadows just as the blood began to spill. Jedediah Beaumont knew the sounds of the Bitterroot Mountains better than he knew the sound of his own voice. For 6 years, the former Pinkerton detective had lived almost entirely off the grid, a ghost haunting the jagged peaks of the Idaho Territory with his two younger brothers. It was the brutal winter of 1878, a season that had already claimed the lives of seasoned trappers and Nez Perce alike. Jed had been hauling a freshly skinned timber wolf over his broad shoulder when the unnatural stillness of the woods was violently fractured by that first distant gunshot. A warning shot, he had thought. The second was closer. He had dropped the pelt, his hand instinctively falling to the worn walnut grip of his Colt Single Action Army revolver. Inside the breast pocket of his bearskin coat against his heart was a folded letter. 3 months old, read so many times the creases had begun to wear through. It was signed Hannah Mae Brennan, Helena, Montana territory, and it had arrived at the Salmon Falls trading post in the late summer with a tintype photograph wrapped in oilcloth. She was supposed to have come to Salmon Falls 8 days ago. She had not come. Toby had ridden down to the trading post twice in the snow to ask. The stagecoach driver had shaken his head both times. No woman matching the description, no telegram, nothing. Jed had told his brothers she had likely changed her mind. Toby had wanted to ride for Helena. Ezra had quietly said they should wait, that a woman traveling alone in winter could be delayed by any number of things. But Jed had felt something else, something colder than the wind, something that felt less like disappointment and more like dread. A woman did not answer an advertisement, sign a marriage contract, send a tintype, and then simply vanish unless something had reached her first. So when the second gunshot cracked across the valley and Jed crested the ridge above the frozen creek and saw her running, he understood in the way a man understands a truth he has been circling for days, that he was looking at his own future being chased through the snow by men with rifles. She was a vision of desperate, ruined elegance, a woman in a torn, soot-stained emerald riding habit tearing through the knee-deep drifts. Her dark hair had escaped its pins whipping wildly around a face pale with sheer terror. She was not dressed for the mountains, she was dressed for the parlor rooms of a city, and the devil was coming for her. 3 riders broke through the tree line across the creek. Jed recognized the coats, heavy buffalo hide dusters, the unofficial uniform of the bounty hunters employed by corrupt territorial marshals. The lead rider, a hulking brute with a scarred jaw, raised his smoking Winchester. Jed watched the horrific geometry of the moment unfold. The woman glanced back, stumbling over a submerged root. The crossfire caught her. The bullet struck her squarely in the right shoulder blade. The kinetic force of the heavy round pitched her violently forward. She went limp instantly, her momentum carrying her toward the hard, icy edge of a jagged boulder that would have crushed her skull upon impact. Jed did not think. The primal protective instinct he thought he had buried at the Little Bighorn surged to life. He launched himself down the embankment. In a blur of motion, he slid across the ice, his massive arms wrapping around her waist and shoulders, absorbing the brutal impact of her fall. He caught her inches before her head struck the granite, dragging them both behind the massive stone, just as another bullet whined off the rock face, showering them in sharp granite splinters. She was terrifyingly light, a fragile bird caught in a tempest. Jed looked down. Her eyes were fluttering shut, her lips parted in a silent cry. The rich emerald fabric of her dress was rapidly darkening with a horrifying spread of crimson. "Hold on," he growled, his voice a gravelly rasp unused to conversation. The ledger she choked out, blood bubbling at the corner of her mouth. Her trembling gloved hand clutched desperately at a leather satchel slung across her chest. "Don't let Lockhart get..." She lost consciousness, her head lolling against his chest. Footsteps crunched on the snow across the creek. The bounty hunters were dismounting, drawing their sidearms. Spread out, the lead man barked, his voice carrying clearly on the frigid air. She took around to the back. "She ain't going far. Find her and get that bag." Jed had no time. He scooped the woman into his arms, hoisting her over his shoulder as easily as he had the wolf pelt. He knew every ravine, every cave, every blind drop in this territory. He backed away from the boulder, carefully stepping in the deep tracks of a passing elk herd to mask his own boot prints. He moved like a phantom up the steepest part of the incline, ascending into a treacherous gorge known to the locals as Dead Man's Drop. The terrain was impassable on horseback. It would force the pursuers to climb on foot. The wind began to howl, a bitter northern gale sweeping down from the Canadian border. It was a blessing and a curse. The blowing snow would erase his tracks within minutes, but the plummeting temperature threatened to freeze the bleeding woman to death before he could ever reach the cabin. For 3 grueling miles he climbed. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed in protest, but the warm, sticky blood seeping through his thick bearskin coat drove him forward. This was not just a mountain rescue. He could feel the leather satchel pressed against his ribs where she hung over his shoulder, and he could feel something inside him that he had not allowed himself to feel in 6 years, a stubborn and dangerous certainty that whoever this woman was, she had crossed Marshal Cyrus Lockhart, the most powerful and ruthless lawman in the Montana Territory, a man Jed knew from a past life he had tried desperately to forget. As the last light of the winter sun bled from the sky, leaving the mountains wrapped in a bruised violet twilight, Jed finally reached the hidden plateau where the cabin sat, nestled against a sheer rock face. He kicked the heavy oak door open, the hinges groaning in the cold. Jed Ezra called from the stove where he was stirring a pot of venison stew with the unhurried hand of a man who had set bones in field hospitals from Antietam to the wilderness. What in God's name? Toby was already on his feet, the rifle he had been cleaning falling forgotten on the table. The youngest Beaumont, 26 years old, fair-haired and quick-eyed, took 2 steps forward and stopped dead. His mouth opened, closed. "Lay her on the table," Ezra said, all softness gone from his voice. "Now, face down. Toby, more lanterns. All of them. Jed, get the whiskey and the iron forceps from the second drawer, and put more water on the stove." Jed laid her on the heavy dining table, sweeping aside a map of the territory and a scatter of trapping supplies. Toby stood frozen, staring at the woman's face. Then his hand went very slowly to his shirt pocket. He pulled out a small folded square of oilcloth. "Jed," Toby said, and his voice cracked on the word. "Jed, look." He unfolded the oilcloth and held up the tintype. 3 lanterns burned now over the table. The light fell on the woman's face, on the dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and snow on the high cheekbones and the parted lips and the pale closed eyelids. Then the light fell on the small image in Toby's trembling hand. The same face, younger looking in the photograph, stiffer, formal in the way of all studio portraits, but the same face. Ezra stopped what he was doing for one full breath. Hannah Toby whispered. Hannah Mae Brennan. Jed, this is her. This is our bride. Jed did not answer for a long moment. The wind hammered the cabin walls. Inside his coat, the letter she had written him pressed against his ribs like a brand. She was supposed to have been at Salmon Falls 8 days ago, he said, finally, his voice rough. She wasn't running from us, Toby said. She was running to us, and someone shot her in the back for it. Then we are going to make sure she lives, Ezra said quietly, and we are going to make sure that the man who put a bullet in her back understands what kind of mistake he has made. But first I need both of you to do exactly what I tell you, Toby. Boil that water, Jed. Whiskey. Forceps. Now. The next hour passed in a kind of grim, silent choreography. Ezra stripped back the soot-stained emerald cloth and exposed the wound, an ugly, puckered hole pouring dark blood. As his rough, calloused fingers probed the area, he felt a hard lump just beneath the collarbone on the front side. The bullet had passed through the scapula and lodged just beneath the skin in the front. It had not hit the lung, or she would already be drowning in her own blood. But the shattered bone and the lead were a death sentence if left untreated. I'm sorry for this, Miss Ezra muttered to the unconscious woman, retrieving a bottle of high-proof rye whiskey. He poured a generous amount directly into the open wound. She screamed, a raw, ragged sound that tore through the cabin, her body arching off the table as consciousness violently snapped back. Toby flinched. Jed did not. He had pinned her good shoulder down before she could fling herself off the table. Hold still, Ezra commanded, his hands as steady as a clockmaker's. I have to cut the lead out. If you move, the blade will slip, and you will bleed out before sunrise. Tears streamed down her face, cutting tracks through the soot and grime. Her vision was blurry. She looked up at 3 hulking silhouettes of men with wild hair and thick beards and eyes she could not yet see clearly. Who? She gasped. My name is Ezra Beaumont, the man with the knife said. The big one holding your shoulder is my brother Jedediah. The one staring at you from the foot of the table is our youngest brother, Tobias. You are in our home, and you are currently dying. He did not sugarcoat it. The frontier had no room for gentle lies. I need to make an incision on your collarbone to push the slug out. It is going to hurt worse than the shot itself. Do you understand me? She clenched her jaw. Her eyes found his. Beneath the terror, Ezra saw a flash of pure, unadulterated steel. Do it, she whispered. Just save the satchel. Ezra nodded. He sterilized his hunting knife in the boiling water, then held the blade to the flame of the lantern. Toby pressed a thick piece of saddle leather into her good hand. Bite down hard, Toby said softly. His voice shook. I'll be right here. She took the leather between her teeth. Ezra did not hesitate. He made a swift, precise cut over the lump at her collarbone. She muffled a shriek, her fingers digging into the rough wood of the table until her knuckles turned white. With the iron forceps Jed had laid out, Ezra reached into the bloody incision. Metal scraped against bone, a sickening sound that turned even Jed's stomach. Ezra clamped down on the deformed piece of lead and pulled it free, dropping it with a heavy clink into a tin cup. He packed both wounds with clean cotton, boiled in the snowmelt. He bound her shoulder tightly with torn strips of clean linen, immobilizing her arm against her chest. By the time he finished, her body had gone limp again. She was burning up. The fever had set in her body, fighting the trauma and the dirt the bullet had dragged into her flesh. Jed carried her more gently this time to the bed in the back room, a thick mattress of pine needles covered in heavy buffalo robes. Toby brought a basin of cool water and a clean cloth and set them on the small table beside the bed without being asked. Ezra leaned against the wall for a moment and closed his eyes. He looked in that moment like a man who had not been a doctor in 14 years, but who had remembered too well. Will she live? Toby asked quietly. Ezra opened his eyes. If the fever breaks, if the wound does not turn, if she is as strong on the inside as her face suggests she is on the outside. Yes. Toby looked down at the woman in the bed. The wife. 3 brothers had agreed after months of arguing to share. The wife none of them had met, the wife who had been shot in the back trying to reach them. I'll take the first watch, he said. For 2 days, a brutal blizzard battered the cabin. The wind screamed like a dying animal dumping 3 feet of fresh powder over the mountains. Inside, the 3 brothers fought a different kind of storm. The woman thrashed in the grip of delirium. She spoke in fractured, feverish sentences that painted a terrifying picture for the brothers who sat in shifts beside her bed. The deeds she mumbled, sweating through the blankets. Higgins Ranch, they burned it. Lockhart signed them. False foreclosures, railroad money, blood money. Jed carved a piece of driftwood by the lantern and listened. The O'Malley children, she whispered later, did not die in any Indian raid. He sold the land before the bodies were cold. Ezra, holding her good hand and pressing a cool cloth to her forehead, closed his eyes briefly. 12 names, she murmured, at one point half conscious. 12 names in the ledger. Mrs. Pritchard taught me in Sunday school. Mr. Calhoun gave me peppermint when I was a child. 12. Toby sat by the stove with the rifle across his knees. watching the door, listening, learning a story he had not asked to hear. Cyrus Lockhart had always been a snake. Jed knew that from the old days. But if this woman's fever dreams were true, he had graduated from simple graft to orchestrating a massive land grab. The Northern Pacific Railway was pushing west, and land in its path was worth a fortune. Lockhart was using his badge to slaughter ranchers' forge deeds and sell the land to the railroad barons in Helena, and Hannah Mae Brennan, a clerk at the Territorial Bank, had stolen the proof. On the night of the second day, the wind softened. The blizzard's worst had passed. Toby gently wiped her forehead with a cool, damp cloth, and her eyes fluttered open. The glazed look of fever had broken. She blinked, taking in the rustic timber ceiling, the roaring stove, and finally the young man sitting beside the bed with hair the color of late summer wheat and eyes the color of new spring grass. "You're alive," Toby said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. She tried to sit up. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as the pain in her shoulder flared. She fell back against the furs. Ezra appeared in the doorway with a cup of broth. "Easy, Miss Brennan. Easy. You have been very ill for a long time. Do you remember anything?" "I remember running," she said quietly. I remember a man catching me before I hit the rock. I remember the knife and the whiskey." She paused. Her eyes moved past Ezra to the larger figure now filling the doorway behind him. "Jed." "You called me Miss Brennan," she said, looking at Ezra. Ezra inclined his head. "Toby recognized you from the photograph you sent." Hannah Mae closed her eyes. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the hiss of the stove. When she opened her eyes again, they were wet, but her voice was steady. "I am sorry I did not come to Salmon Falls," she said. "I had every intention of being there on the day I told you I was on the train. I had my ticket, I had the contract in my satchel, and then in Helena I learned that Marshal Lockhart had been told by one of his men that someone in the bank had asked too many questions about the Higgins deed. He came back to town 3 days earlier than I had calculated. I had to leave that night. I could not wait for the Northern Pacific. I hired a guide who took me as far as the eastern foothills. He turned back when he saw the storm coming. I tried to walk the rest of the way. They overtook me on the third day." She swallowed. Her hand searched the bed beside her. The satchel," Toby said before she could ask. He lifted it from the chair where it had been waiting. "We didn't open it." She took it with her good hand and held it against her chest like a child. "Thank you." Then she looked at the three of them one after another, slowly, her eyes still glassy with weakness, but clear now. "Mr. Beaumont," she said to Jed. "Dr. Beaumont," she said to Ezra. "Mr. Beaumont," she said to Toby, and a faint, sad smile touched her mouth. "I did not picture meeting you like this. I had a speech prepared. I rehearsed it on the train. I do not think I can remember a single word of it now." Jed crossed the small room and pulled a stool to the side of the bed and sat down. He was an enormous man, and the stool creaked under him, but he leaned forward with surprising care, his elbows on his knees, his gray eyes level with hers. "Then talk to us plain," he said. "No speeches. Plain words. Who are you? What is in that satchel? And who shot you?" She drew in a slow breath. The pain of it tightened her face, then passed. "My name is Hannah Mae Brennan. I am 24 years old. My father was the Reverend Ezekiel Brennan of the Methodist Episcopal Church in St. Louis. My mother died of pneumonia when I was 11. My father died of a wasting illness 3 winters ago, and after I buried him, I followed an aunt to Helena who took me in for a season and then died as well. I had no living family. I had taken work at the Territorial Bank as a clerk. My father had taught me ciphering and ledger work because he believed a woman should be able to keep accounts in a world that would otherwise cheat her." She paused, gathering herself. "About a year ago, I began to notice large sums of unrecorded gold passing through the bank's vault. At the same time, deeds for ranches I knew began to cross my desk. The Higgins family, the O'Malley family, the Calhoun place, all of them either burned out or murdered supposedly by Indian raiders, and their land transferred within a week to a holding company controlled by Marshal Cyrus Lockhart, which in turn sold it to agents of the Northern Pacific Railway. For 6 months, I copied every transaction. I matched every signature against the originals on file. I built a record, and then 2 months ago, when Lockhart was traveling, I broke into his private safe in the back of the marshal's office at night, and I took his shadow ledger." She unbuckled the satchel with trembling fingers and pulled out a thick black leather book. "This," she said, "is every bribe he has ever paid, every name on his payroll, every forged signature, the names of the men he hired to murder 12 people I knew. It is the rope that will hang him." Toby exhaled slowly. Ezra did not move. Jed looked at the book a long time. You should have taken this to a federal judge in Denver or San Francisco, he said finally. Why did you run west into the mountains? Because Lockhart owns the telegraph lines and the stagecoach routes out of Helena, she said. Because the moment he realized the ledger was gone, he would put a bounty on my head, because the only way for a single woman to leave Helena in winter without raising suspicion was as a bride. She lifted her chin. I answered your advertisement 3 months ago, she said, before I had the ledger. Before I knew if I could even get it. I wrote because I had decided that whether or not I succeeded in stealing the proof, I was going to leave that town. I was not going to spend another year watching ranchers' widows cry in the lobby of that bank. I wrote to you and to 2 other listings. I chose you because you live the farthest from any railroad spur, the farthest from any telegraph wire, and because the advertisement said 3 brothers were seeking a wife in common. I judged that 3 armed men in a remote cabin would be the only kind of household where a woman with a stolen ledger and a price on her head might survive the winter. A long quiet settled over the room. You picked us, Toby said slowly, because we were the most defensible position. Yes, Hannah May said, and because the letter you sent me back, Mr. Beaumont. She looked at Toby. The letter was not the letter of a man who was simply lonely. It was the letter of a man who wanted a partner. You wrote that you did not want a wife who would only cook and keep silent. You wrote that your brothers had agreed to this arrangement because none of you wished to bring a woman into the mountains who would wither here. You wrote that whoever answered should come knowing she would be expected to think for herself and to be respected for it. I read that letter 11 times before I sent my reply. I have it in the satchel still. Toby looked at his hands. I meant every word he said softly. I know, she said. That is why I came. Jed leaned back. He looked at Ezra. Ezra looked at Toby. Toby looked at her. You are still bound by that contract, Hannah May said carefully, if you wish to be. I will not hold you to it. I came to you under false pretenses in the sense that I did not tell you what I was carrying. I will not blame any of you if you choose to put me on a horse as soon as I can ride and send me toward the Canadian border with the satchel and a blessing. But I will tell you this. The contract is signed. It is witnessed. It is filed at the territorial clerk's office in Helena under your 3 names and mine. And in the Idaho territory, a woman who has signed and filed a marriage contract cannot be lawfully arrested by a marshal from another territory without the written consent of her betrothed husbands. It is an old statute. Most marshals do not know it. Cyrus Lockhart certainly does not. I do, because I read every statute that touched on women and contracts and bank accounts in the year after my father died. When I was trying to understand what protections I had left in this world, Jed stared at her. You did not pick us only for the cabin, he said slowly. I picked you for the cabin and the law, she said. I am sorry. I should have told you before I came. I was going to tell you at Salmon Falls. I was not going to lie to you a single day longer than I had to. Hannah May Toby said. Yes. Why are you apologizing? Because she whispered and her composure finally cracked, because 3 good men answered an advertisement hoping for a wife, and I wrote back to them with a half-truth, and now one of you has carried me through 3 miles of blizzard, and another of you has cut a bullet out of my chest, and the third of you has been sitting beside this bed for 2 days, and I did all of that to you on purpose without your knowing. Jed stood up. He walked to the window. He scraped a small clear circle in the frost and looked out at the moonlit snow. For a long time he did not speak. Miss Brennan, he said finally, without turning around. Yes. 6 years ago, I quit the Pinkerton agency because I tracked a killer for half a year across the Dakotas, brought him in alive to stand trial, and watched a judge who was a friend of the killer's father walk him out the back door of the courthouse the next morning with his bounty money in his pocket. He killed 2 more people inside of a month before a farmer finally shot him. I came out here because I had decided that the law was a tool for men with money and that justice did not live in courthouses anymore. I told my brothers as much. They came with me. He turned around. You walked into a bank every day for 3 years and watched the same kind of thing happen. And instead of running, you copied the ledgers. You broke into a man's safe. You filed a marriage contract in a territorial office to use a statute most lawyers do not remember. And you wrote to 3 strangers in a cabin, and you came up here on purpose because you had calculated correctly that we were the only people in the territory who would not sell you out. He looked at his brothers. Ezra, Toby. Yes, Ezra said. We agreed 3 months ago that whoever answered us would be our wife. We did, Toby said. Has anything she just told us made any of you want to change that? No, Ezra said. No, Toby said, and his voice was thick. Then nothing has changed, Jed said, except that we now know the wife we agreed to take is also the bravest person any of the three of us has ever met, and that there is a man named Cyrus Lockhart who sent 3 riders into our mountains today to put another bullet in her. He walked back to the bed and looked down at her. The contract stands, Miss Brennan, he said, if you still want it to. Hannah May did not trust herself to speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice was very small but very firm. I still want it to. Then welcome home, Jed said. Toby reached out and took her good hand and held it like a man holding something he had been afraid he would never be permitted to touch. Ezra cleared his throat. She needs to eat, he said, and then she needs to sleep. And in the morning we are going to plan, because 3 men do not ride into these mountains alone in winter unless more men are coming behind them. Hannah May ate 3 spoons of broth and slept for 14 hours. She woke to gray dawn and the smell of coffee. She woke to the realization that she had a home and 3 husbands in every way that mattered, if not yet in every way the law recognized, and that she had not slept that well since she was a child in her father's house. She also woke to the sound of a single distant snap of a frozen pine branch breaking under the deliberate weight of a boot. In the front room, Jed had heard it first. He blew out the lantern in a single breath, plunging the cabin into darkness. Down, he hissed. Ezra was already on the floor. Toby moved to the window with the rifle. Hannah May appeared in the doorway of the back room, pale, one hand pressed to her bound shoulder, the other clutching the door frame. She did not ask what was happening. She read the room in one glance. What do you need me to do? She whispered. Stay low, Toby said. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pressed his Colt revolver into her good hand. If anyone comes through that door and it is not one of the 3 of us, you empty the cylinder. Do you understand me? She nodded, her hand closed around the grip. It was the first time in her life she had held a loaded firearm. Lord, forgive me, she whispered, then more steadily, I understand. Jed slipped his Bowie knife from its sheath. The blade was forged from high carbon steel, dulled black so it would not catch the moonlight. A gunshot would echo down the mountain and bring the rest of the posse. The scout could not be allowed to leave, and he could not be killed loudly. I'll go, Jed said. Toby. Window. Ezra. Back door. He slipped out the rear of the cabin as silently as a thought, and was gone. Hannah May sat on the floor with her back to the cold iron of the stove. The Colt was heavy in her hand. Toby crouched at the window. Ezra stood at the back door with the shotgun. Are you praying? Toby whispered without turning his head. I am, she whispered back. Don't stop. Outside, the scout was named Lefty Higgins, no relation to the murdered ranchers, just another desperate gun for hire. Lefty was cold and miserable and complaining under his breath as he trudged through the snow toward the cabin. He paused. He raised a pair of brass binoculars. He spotted the faint thread of smoke that had risen from the chimney before Jed had killed the fire and the yellow seam of light around the door before Jed had killed the lantern. Well, 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 Lefty muttered, a cruel smile splitting his frostbitten lips. Found the little bird's nest. He turned to head back down the trail. He took exactly 3 steps before a hand the size of a dinner plate clamped over his mouth. The smell of leather and pine needles and bear grease overwhelmed his senses. Jed had dropped from a low-hanging pine branch directly behind him. With terrifying mechanical efficiency, Jed drove the Bowie knife upward, slipping it between the man's ribs and directly into his heart. Lefty convulsed, once his eyes rolling back before going entirely limp. Jed lowered the body silently to the snow, ensuring the Sharps buffalo rifle slung on his back did not clatter against the rocks. He stood over the dead man, his chest heaving, the adrenaline singing in his veins. Then he searched the man's pockets. He found a crude, hand-drawn map. He struck a match, shielding the flame with his coat. The map detailed the valley below. Lefty had not been alone. The map showed an encampment. Cyrus Lockhart had sent a small army. 15 men camped at the base of Dead Man's Drop, waiting for the scout's report. Jed extinguished the match. A cold dread settled in his stomach. He dragged the body into a thicket of brush, buried it under a heavy mound of snow, and made his way back to the cabin with his jaw set. He bolted the door behind him. Toby was still at the window. Ezra was still at the back. Hannah May was still on the floor by the stove with the Colt in her hand and her lips moving silently. It is done, Jed said. She lowered the gun. He spread the stolen map out on the table by the dim light of the glowing stove door. Toby and Ezra came in close. Hannah May rose, one hand still bracing her shoulder, and joined them. Lockhart did not just send 3 bounty hunters, Jed said quietly. He sent a war party. 15 men are camped at the bottom of the gorge. They will know their scout is missing by dawn. When the sun comes up, they are going to come up this mountain. Toby looked at the map, then at the cabin walls, then at his brothers, then at the woman beside him. We can't fight 15 men in this cabin, he said. No, Jed said, we can't. He looked up at his brothers. His eyes were as hard and cold as winter granite. But I know a place where 4 people can fight 15, he said. And I know how to make sure most of them never come back down. Hannah May looked at the map. Her eyes moved over the contour lines over the marks in Lefty's clumsy hand until she found a small, sketched square halfway up the ridge behind the cabin marked with a single word. Widowmaker, she read aloud. Yes, Jed said. She remembered then. A foreclosure file that had crossed her desk in Helena 2 summers before, a failed silver mine, 10 men buried in a collapse, the bankruptcy, the abandoned shafts. The mine that fell in on its own owners, she said softly. Yes, Jed said. He looked at her with something that was almost a smile, except his eyes did not smile. You know it. I read every file that came across my desk, she said. I told you. My father raised me to keep accounts. Then you also know, she went on, what an old mine full of rotten timbers and unstable shale will do if a man knew exactly where to set a charge. Jed's almost smile sharpened. That he said is exactly the question I was about to ask. Outside, the wind began to rise again, and somewhere down in the valley below, 15 men slept around their campfires, waiting for a scout who was never going to return. Inside the cabin, 4 people stood around a stolen map by the glow of a stove and began very quietly to plan a war. They did not sleep that night. Jed laid out every weapon they owned on the heavy dining table, and the 4 of them stood around it the way other families stood around a Christmas tree, the Winchester repeating rifle, Toby's long, Sharps buffalo gun, accurate to half a mile in good hands, the double-barreled shotgun that Ezra had carried since the war, 2 Colt revolvers, including the one Toby had pressed into Hannah Mae's hand, a pair of cap and ball Remingtons that had been their father's, boxes of ammunition pulled up from beneath the floorboards, each one marked in charcoal with the year they had been packed, and in a small wooden crate stenciled with the faded words, Hercules Powder Company, 12 sticks of dynamite, the wax paper darkened where the nitroglycerin had begun to weep through. Hannah Mae looked at the dynamite a long time. That is unstable, she said. Yes, Ezra said. How long has it been in this cabin? 3 years, Jed said. We bought it from a prospector who was leaving the territory. She did not say anything for a moment. She was thinking about what 3 years of mountain cold and mountain heat did to a stick of dynamite. She was thinking about what a man named Alfred Nobel had written in a pamphlet she had read once at the bank about how the worst dynamite was the kind that had begun to sweat because that was the kind that no longer needed a fuse to detonate, the kind that could go off if a man dropped it, the kind that could go off if a man looked at it wrong. That, she said quietly, is also exactly what we need. Jed looked at her. A stable charge would simply blow a hole in the rock, she said. We do not want a hole. We want a collapse. We want the entire ceiling to come down. Unstable powder packed against rotten timbers will bring the mountain down on top of itself. The men inside will not be killed by the blast. They will be buried by what comes after. Toby had been looking at her with an expression she had not seen on a man's face before. It was not exactly admiration. It was closer to wonder. Hannah Mae, he said, where did a Methodist minister's daughter learn to think like that? I was a clerk for 3 years in a bank that lent money to mining companies, she said. I read every report we ever filed on a collapse. I read what the inspectors wrote, and I read what the lawyers wrote afterward to keep the company from being sued. After a while, you learn the shape of how a mine kills people. She paused. I had hoped never to use it. Jed picked up one of the sticks of dynamite. He held it the way a man holds an infant. Then we are going to use it well, he said. They left the cabin 1 hour before dawn. Jed stoked the iron stove until the cast iron glowed cherry red. He left 2 kerosene lanterns burning in the windows. The flames turned low so they would last. Smoke curled from the chimney. Anyone watching the cabin from the valley below would see warmth and light and assume 4 people were inside sleeping unaware. Lockhart's men would come up the mountain confident the way men always came confident toward a place they thought was full of sleeping prey. Toby went out first, breaking trail in the deep new snow with his long stride. Jed went last, carrying the wooden crate against his chest as gently as he had ever carried anything in his life. In between them walked Ezra and Hannah Mae Ezra's arm around her waist, taking weight off her wounded shoulder on the steeper pitches. Every step burned in her shoulder. Every step felt like a small, bright knife being turned. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, and she did not slow down, and she did not stop. Almost there, Jed called back over the howling gale, his voice rough with cold and effort. She nodded against Ezra's shoulder. She could not spare the breath for words. The path to the abandoned silver mine was little more than a treacherous goat trail winding up the jagged spine of the mountain. The wind here was feral, whipping ice crystals into their faces like shards of broken glass. They reached the yawning black mouth of the mine just as the eastern horizon began to bleed a pale, bruised purple. The timber frame surrounding the entrance was rotting. A faded, weathered sign hung crookedly from one nail. The Widowmaker, claimed 1872. They dug too deep too fast, Jed muttered, striking a match to light a heavy brass kerosene lantern. He guided Hannah May into the cavernous tunnel. The air inside was dead smelling of sulfur and damp earth and decades of forgotten toil. Hit a pocket of loose shale. The main shaft collapsed and buried 10 men. The company went bankrupt trying to dig them out, and it has been empty ever since. He led them deep into the labyrinth, taking a dizzying series of left and right turns through the subterranean dark until they reached a massive cavernous junction where 3 tunnels converged. This is the choke point, Jed said, setting the lantern down. He opened the wooden crate. The 12 sticks lay inside on a bed of straw, dark and sweating in the lantern light. He began to wedge them one by one into the load-bearing timber supports that held up the cavern ceiling. He worked in silence, the way a man works when one slip of his hand will end every life in the room. He ran a long fuse down the length of the tunnel, paying it out behind him, trailing it up to a high ledge that overlooked the junction. While he worked, Ezra led Hannah May into a small alcove off the main chamber, a dry pocket where a long-forgotten miner had once carved a rough wooden bench into the rock. He set the lantern on the bench and began to unwrap the bandage over her shoulder. The wound is angry, he said quietly, but it is not infected. The climb has reopened the front incision. I am going to repack it. I would rather not stitch you again until we are back in the cabin. She nodded. He worked. His hands were warm. They were the same hands that had cut the bullet out of her 3 days before, but in the lantern light, they were no longer the hands of an executioner. They were the hands of a husband, Ezra, she said after a long quiet. Yes. Tell me about her. He stopped working. He did not look up. About who, he said softly, although they both knew. About the wife who came before me. He was quiet for a long time. The lantern flame leaned in the still, cold air of the mine. From somewhere deep in the earth came the slow, patient drip of water on stone. Her name was Sarah, he said finally. She had hair the color of new copper. We were married in 1861 in a small chapel in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 2 weeks before I shipped out as a contract surgeon with the Army of the Potomac. We had a son. His name was Tommy. He was born while I was at Antietam. I held him for the first time when he was 4 months old on a furlough at Christmas. He laughed when I lifted him. He had 2 teeth. He took a breath. I went back to the war. I served at Gettysburg. I served in the wilderness. I came home to Lancaster in the spring of '64 with a furlough I had begged for 3 months too late. There had been cholera in the town that February. Sarah and Tommy were already in the ground. Tommy was 2 years old. He had been calling for me at the end. The neighbor woman who buried them told me that. She thought I should know. He had not raised his voice. His hands kept moving on the bandage, steady and gentle. I served out the rest of the war. I came west in '72 when Jed asked me to come. I have not been back to Lancaster. I have not been to a cemetery. I have not been a doctor in 14 years. Hannah May lifted her good hand and put it over his. He went very still. You are still a doctor, she said softly. You cut a bullet out of me on a kitchen table by lantern light, and you did not lose me. You have been a doctor in every hour since the moment my brother carried me through your door. Sarah and Tommy did not die because you were not a doctor. They died because you were a doctor in a place where you were needed by other men's wives and other men's sons. That is not the same thing as failing them. Ezra closed his eyes. I will pray for them tonight, she said, by name, Sarah Beaumont, Thomas Beaumont. I will pray for them every night that I am given to draw breath. They are my family now. We do not stop praying for our family because they have gone ahead of us. We pray harder. Ezra Beaumont had not wept since he had stood in front of 2 raw mounds of earth in a Pennsylvania graveyard in the spring of 1864. He wept now quietly, his forehead pressed against the back of her hand. She let him. She did not speak. She did not move. Outside the alcove, somewhere in the dark of the mine, she could hear the faint sound of Jed humming under his breath as he set the last charge, an old hymn she recognized from her father's church. After a long time, Ezra straightened. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. He finished the bandage. He picked up the lantern. He looked at her. Thank you, he said. That is what wives are for, she said. He smiled. It was a small, sad, real smile, the first real smile she had seen on his face. Hannah May, he said, yes, there is something I must tell you before what is coming. Tell me. If we live through today, he said, I would like to be the one who teaches you how to handle a needle and gut. I would like to teach you which mountain plants will bring down a fever and which will close a wound. I would like to teach you what I know, not because I expect you to need it, because I would like there to be one more person in this world who carries what I learned in those hospital tents. I am willing, she said. Good, Ezra said. He lifted the lantern. Then she rose and followed him back into the main chamber, and on the way, she stopped and laid her good hand briefly on his shoulder, and he covered her hand with his own, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed to be said. While Ezra was tending to Hannah May's wound, Jed and Toby were on the high ledge above the junction, lying flat on their bellies on the cold stone, looking down at the tunnel. Toby said quietly, yes. I want to ask you something, and I want you to give me a real answer. Ask. When you signed that contract 3 months ago, did you mean it? About taking a wife in common, about all three of us? Or were you just doing it to keep me from running off and getting myself killed in some town somewhere because I was lonely? Jed looked at his youngest brother for a long moment in the gloom. I meant it, he said. Not at first. At first, I signed it because I love you and Ezra, and I had watched the two of you grow quieter every winter for 6 years, and I was afraid we were going to bury one another up here without ever having lived. I signed it for you. But somewhere in those 3 months of waiting, I started to mean it for me too. I started to think about a woman in our cabin, a woman at our table, children maybe, a future instead of just a season. By the time her tintype came in the mail, I had stopped pretending. I was waiting for her Toby, the way a man waits for spring. Toby was quiet a long time. She picked us, he said. Out of all the listings and all the territories, she picked us on purpose. She read your letter 11 times. I read hers more than that, Jed said. Toby almost laughed. Are we going to get through today? He asked. Yes, Jed said. We are, because we have to, and because she is upstairs from us right now, letting Ezra weep for the first time in 14 years, and a woman who can do that is not a woman God brings into a man's life, only to take her away 3 days later. I do not believe that. I refuse to believe that. All right, Toby said. All right, then. He shouldered his sharps. Jed checked the fuse one last time. They waited. An hour passed in suffocating darkness. The only sound was the steady drip of condensation falling from the cavern roof and the ragged rhythm of Hannah Mae's breathing in the alcove behind them where she sat with the double-barreled shotgun across her lap. Then they heard it. The crunch of heavy boots on loose gravel, the faint flickering glow of torches painting the tunnel walls in dancing orange light. Boone Tate was leading the pack, a heavy Walker Colt in one hand, a torch in the other. Behind him, 14 men filed into the narrow tunnel, coughing on the stale air, their heavy buffalo coats scraping against the rock walls. Keep your eyes peeled, Tate bellowed, his voice echoing violently through the mine. They are in here. I can smell the fresh boot prints. Spread out when we hit the junction. On the high ledge, Jed crouched beside the end of the fuse with a strike anywhere match in his fingers. He waited until the entire posse had funneled into the main cavern directly beneath the rigged timber supports. Welcome to the Widowmaker, boys, he whispered. He struck the match. The fuse hissed to life, a sparking, spitting snake of fire racing down the rocks and disappearing into the darkness toward the timber supports. Fuse, one of the bounty hunters, screamed, pointing at the sparks. Fuse, look out. Tate raised his revolver and fired blindly into the dark, but it was too late. The weeping dynamite detonated with a catastrophic, earth-shattering roar. The concussion punched the air from Hannah Mae's lungs in the alcove. The deafening sound rang in her ears like the inside of a bell. A massive wall of fire and pulverized rock tore through the junction. The ceiling groaned a long, terrible sound like a dying leviathan, and then thousands of tons of shale and granite collapsed. The avalanche of stone crushed the back half of the posse, instantly burying 7 men under an impenetrable wall of rubble and sealing the rear of the tunnel. Dust choked the cavern thick and suffocating. Move Tate roared through the coughing and the chaos, scrambling forward with the surviving men. Move forward away from the collapse. Find them. Find them. Jed did not give them a moment to recover. He dropped from the ledge like a falling shadow, landing squarely on a disoriented bounty hunter. The heavy Bowie knife flashed in the dim light of a dropped torch and found its mark. Jed was a ghost in the smoke, using the labyrinth of boulders and dust to his absolute advantage. The Winchester barked 3 times. 3 rapid flashes in the dark. 3 more of Tate's men hit the cavern floor. Fire, Tate yelled, discharging his Walker Colt into the shadows. Fire, you cowards, shoot the bastard. The cavern erupted into a chaotic, terrifying firefight lead, whining off stone and sparking in the darkness. Toby fired the sharps from a different position than they had expected, then moved, then fired again. 2 more men down. In the alcove, Hannah Mae stayed flat on her stomach, the shotgun braced against her good shoulder, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the swirling dust and the orange flickering of dropped torches, she saw a man creeping up the jagged incline toward the alcove. A hunting knife was clenched in his teeth. He had seen her position. He thought he had a soft target. She remembered Toby's words. She did not hesitate. She remembered her father's words, too, the ones he had said over her mother's grave when she was 11 years old. Thou shalt not kill, he had said, but he had also said in another sermon. She remembered with painful clarity that the law of the home was the oldest law God had given. A father defended his children. A husband defended his wife. A wife defended her household. There was no commandment against that. There never had been. She took a slow breath. She swung the heavy double-barreled shotgun around. She braced the stock against her good shoulder and accepted what the kick was going to do to her wound. She squeezed the front trigger. The boom was deafening in the enclosed space. The buckshot caught the man square in the chest, throwing him backward off the rocks to the cavern floor below. Lord Jesus, she whispered, her ears ringing her shoulder, screaming, "Forgive me." She did not lower the shotgun. She had one barrel left. Suddenly a voice echoed through the chamber, a cultivated voice, a voice that did not belong in a mine, a voice that made her blood run cold even before she fully recognized it. "Hold your fire." The shooting stopped abruptly. The dust began to settle, revealing the grim aftermath. Only Boone Tate and one other man remained standing, but it was the second man who made Jed freeze in his tracks. Standing in the center of the cavern, impeccably dressed in a tailored wool suit and a heavy beaver fur coat, was Marshal Cyrus Lockhart. He held a silver-plated Schofield revolver, and the barrel was pressed directly against the temple of a young, terrified man Hannah May had never seen before. Dressed in plain trapper's clothes, his hands raised, his eyes wide. Hannah May's stomach dropped. Lockhart had brought a hostage. I have to admit, Caldwell Lockhart sneered, his voice dripping with venom, and Hannah May felt the air go out of the room because she knew, in the way, a knife is sharp, that the name was wrong, that the name was a name from the past. She had not yet been told that Lockhart was using a name he should not have known. Jed did not flinch. "When I realized it was the legendary Pinkerton detective who had snatched my little clerk," Lockhart went on, "I knew I could not leave this to Tate alone. I took the morning train to the nearest junction and rode up with the reinforcements. He kicked the dead body of one of his men. You have cost me a fortune in manpower, Caldwell, but I will forgive it all, walk away, leave the girl and the ledger, and I will let you vanish back into the snow." Jed stepped out from behind a boulder, his Winchester lowered, but his eyes locked on Lockhart. "You are out of your jurisdiction, Marshal," he said, "and you are out of your mind if you think I am walking away. He does not just want the ledger, Jed." The voice came from the alcove, from above, from her. Hannah May rose to her feet on the high ledge, the shotgun in her hands, the second barrel still loaded, her face pale and bloodless in the dust-hung air. "Tell him the truth, Marshal Lockhart," she called down. "Tell him what is really in that book." Lockhart's eye twitched. His aristocratic composure cracked for a fraction of a second. "The ledger proves the murders," Hannah May continued, her voice ringing with defiance and pain and something close to triumph. "But it also contains the cipher for the safe deposit boxes in Denver. $500,000 in stolen railroad gold. That is why he is up here freezing his polished boots off. He needs the book to get his money. The murders are not what he is afraid of. He has murdered before. He is afraid of being poor again." Toby drew in a sharp breath in the dark. $500,000. Jed had not known. The brothers had not known. Even Hannah May had not been certain of the exact figure until she had cracked the cipher in the back of the ledger on her last night in Helena by candlelight alone. "Shut your mouth, you little thief," Lockhart roared. He swung the silver Schofield up toward the alcove. It was the distraction Jed needed. In a blindingly fast draw, Jed dropped the Winchester and pulled his Colt single-action army. Boone Tate reacted, swinging the heavy Walker Colt toward Jed. Two shots rang out simultaneously. Tate's bullet grazed Jed's ribs, tearing through leather and flesh, spinning him backward. But Jed's aim was true. His heavy .45 caliber slug caught Boone Tate perfectly between the eyes. The hulking bounty hunter crumpled to the ground, dead before he hit the dirt. Lockhart panicked. He shoved his hostage aside and leveled the Schofield at Jed, who was on one knee, now one hand pressed to his bleeding side, the other trying to bring the Colt back up. "No." The word came from above. Hannah May Brennan looked down at the man who had ordered 12 murders, who had burned the Higgins Ranch, who had sold Mrs. Pritchard's land before her body was cold, who had put a bullet in her own back. She looked down at him and she squeezed the second trigger. At that distance, the spread of the buckshot was devastating. The blast caught Marshal Cyrus Lockhart in his right shoulder and chest, shredding his expensive coat and shattering his collarbone. The silver-plated revolver clattered uselessly to the rocks. Lockhart fell hard, gasping, staring in absolute shock at the bleeding clerk on the ledge above him, at the woman he had hunted into the mountains, at the woman he had not believed capable of pulling a trigger on him. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Hannah May did not lower the shotgun. Her hands were shaking. Her bandaged shoulder was on fire. Tears were running silently down her face. But the shotgun stayed up. Toby reached her first, scrambling up the rocks. "Hannah May," he said softly. "Hannah May, it is over. You can put it down. It is over." She let him take the shotgun from her hands. Her knees buckled. He caught her against his chest and held her there, and for the first time since she had left St. Louis, she allowed herself to cry the way a child cries with no thought of who was watching. Below them, Jed clutched his bleeding side and pushed himself up. Ezra came running from the other side of the cavern, his shotgun still smoking from where he had taken down two men in the chaos that Hannah May had not even seen. The two brothers met in the middle of the rubble. Ezra ripped open Jed's coat, examined the wound in two fast professional motions, and exhaled. Through and through, he said, "You will live. You will be sore for a month. Sit down." Jed sat down on a piece of fallen timber and let his brother work. Then he got up again and walked slowly, painfully over to where Cyrus Lockhart lay on the cavern floor, bleeding out into the dust. Jed kicked the Schofield away. He looked down at the corrupt lawman with eyes as hard as the mountain granite around them. "You should have stayed in Helena," Jed rasped. Lockhart choked on a mouthful of blood. The light was fading from his eyes. The empire of corruption he had built had finally crumbled, brought down by a brave clerk and a ghost he should not have disturbed. He was looking at Jed, but he was speaking past him. "You should have stayed dead. Caldwell." Jed crouched down beside him. "I am not Caldwell anymore," he said. "Caldwell died 6 years ago. The man you are looking at is named Beaumont, and the woman you tried to kill is his wife." Lockhart's mouth moved. No sound came out. His eyes glassed. He was gone. Jed stood up. He looked up at the ledge. Hannah May was on her feet again, leaning against Toby. Ezra was already climbing toward them with his medical bag. The four of them met in the middle of the alcove in the orange light of a torch one of them had retrieved, and for a long moment none of them said anything. Then a sound carried through the cavern, a small, frightened, distinctly human sound. The four of them turned. In the swirling dust of the lower chamber, the young hostage Lockhart had brought as his guide sat slumped against a fallen timber, his hands still raised, sobbing quietly. They had all forgotten about him. Jed went down to him. "What is your name, son?" Jed asked, gentling his voice in a way Hannah May had not heard before. "Silas," the young man whispered. "Silas Whitaker. Please, please do not kill me. I am not one of his men. He took me from my farm. He said he would kill my sister if I did not guide him through the snow." Jed lowered his rifle. "How old are you, Silas?" 22, sir. "And your sister?" 17. "Her name is Mary. He is holding her in town. He told his men that if he did not come back, they were too." The boy's voice broke. He did not have to finish the sentence. The four people who had just brought a mountain down on 15 men understood what Cyrus Lockhart's standing orders had been. Hannah May had come down from the ledge, slowly leaning on Toby. She crossed the chamber, knelt beside Silas Whitaker, and laid her hand on his shoulder. Her bandage was bright red, where the recoil of the shotgun had reopened the front wound. She did not seem to notice. "Whitaker," she said softly. "Yes, ma'am." "Was your father named John? And your mother named Eliza?" "Yes, ma'am." They were murdered 4 months ago," she said, "in what was reported as an Indian raid on the road north of Helena. Their farm was foreclosed within 10 days and sold inside of 3 weeks to a holding company called Cascade Land and Title." The boy stared at her. "How?" he whispered. "How did you know that?" "Because their names are in this book," Hannah May said quietly, and she patted the leather satchel still slung against her hip. "Number 9 and number 10. I am so sorry, Silas. I am so very sorry." Silas Whitaker began to weep, real weeping this time, the kind a person does when they have been carrying something alone for months and someone has finally taken hold of one end of it. Jed looked at his brothers looked at him. Mary Whitaker was 17 years old in Helena with men who had been told to kill her if their employer did not come home. Their employer was not coming home. Jed turned to Hannah May. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "I know we do," she said. "But not yet. Get this boy on his feet. Help me back to the cabin. We have a wound to dress and a fire to build and a meal to eat. And then when we have all stopped shaking, we are going to sit at our table and I am going to tell you something I have not yet told you about that ledger. And then my husband's, we are going to ride for Helena." Toby drew in a sharp breath. "Helena," he said. "Helena," she said. She straightened her good shoulder. The other one was bleeding through the bandage. Her face was white. Her eyes were burning. "I did not steal that book to save myself," she said. "I stole it to save people like Mary Whitaker. If I let her die now, then everything I did in Helena was vanity. I will not have it on my soul. I will not have it on yours." She looked at the three of them. "Do you understand me?" she asked very quietly. Jed Beaumont, who had not believed in justice for 6 years, looked at his wife and remembered what he had told her 2 nights before, that justice did not live in courthouses anymore. He understood now that he had been only half right. Justice did not live in courthouses, but justice, it turned out, had been living in a Methodist minister's daughter who had walked into a bank for 3 years and copied the ledgers of dying men. "We understand," he said. "Then let us get out of this mountain," Hannah May said, "and let us go home and plan." They climbed out of the Widowmaker into a morning so bright after the dark of the mine that all 4 of them had to stop and shield their eyes. The sun was climbing over the bitter roots. The new snow lay clean and unbroken across the valley below. Somewhere down there, 15 men's horses were standing, tied in a copse of pines, waiting for riders who were never coming back. Jed looked at his brothers. Toby, ride down. Bring up the horses. All of them. We will need everyone we can move. Take Silas with you. He needs the air. Toby nodded. Ezra, you and I are taking Hannah Mae back to the cabin. She needs that wound stitched again before we do anything else. Ezra was already lifting her good arm carefully over his shoulders. And Hannah Mae, Jed said. She looked up at him. When we get to the cabin, before we plan anything, you are going to tell us the rest of what is in that book, the part you have not told us yet. The part that explains why a clerk who already had enough evidence to hang 12 men kept working anyway. There is more, isn't there? She held his gaze. Yes, she said. There is more. I thought so, Jed said. He almost smiled. 6 years out of the agency, and I can still read a witness. Then more gently, almost shyly, in a tone none of his brothers had ever heard him use, he asked her, can you walk? She managed a small, tired smile. With your arm, she said, I can walk anywhere. He gave her his arm, the four of them plus a young man who an hour before had thought he was going to die in a mine in a marshal's grip, began the long, slow walk back down the goat trail toward the cabin. Behind them, the Widowmaker stood silent on the ridge, holding 15 men in its stone teeth, the sun rising clean and gold over a mountain that had finally claimed its last $10 worth of silver and asked instead to be paid in blood. They came down the mountain in silence. Toby and Silas brought the horses up by mid-morning, 15 good animals stamping in the snow outside the cabin, their breath fogging in the cold. Jed picked the four strongest and turned the rest loose with a slap on their flanks. They would find their way down to a homestead eventually. A man on the run did not steal what he did not need. Inside the cabin, Ezra restitched the front wound on Hannah Mae's collarbone and then made her drink a cup of broth and eat half a biscuit before he would let her speak. She submitted to him with the patience of a woman who had argued with doctors before and lost. When he was satisfied, he sat down across from her at the table. Jed sat at the head of the table. Toby sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder touched hers. Silas Whitaker sat by the stove with a blanket around his shoulders and a tin mug of coffee in his hands, listening, not speaking. The black ledger lay closed between them. Tell us, Jed said. Hannah Mae set her good hand flat on the cover of the book. I told you in the mine that this contains the cipher for the safe deposit boxes in Denver. That is true. What I did not tell you is what I did with that information. She paused. A month before I left Helena, she said I finished the last page of a complete copy of this ledger that I had been making by hand. I had worked at it every night for 2 months after I took the original from his safe in the back of my room with the curtains drawn. I copied every entry. I copied the cipher. I sealed the copy in a leather envelope, and I posted it by registered mail to a man named Judge Augustus Holloway in care of the federal courthouse in San Francisco. Judge Holloway is the senior federal jurist on the Western Circuit. He is also the one man in this part of the country whom Cyrus Lockhart was actually afraid of. I included a sealed letter explaining what the ledger was, where it had come from, and what should be done with it if I did not appear in his chambers within 90 days to claim it. The cabin was very quiet. You sent a copy, Toby said slowly. To a federal judge before you ever left Helena? Yes. So even if Lockhart had killed you on the road, Jed said. The book would have reached San Francisco anyway, she said, within 12 to 14 days of my disappearance. Judge Holloway would have opened the envelope, read the letter, and known exactly who had murdered me and why. Hannah Mae Ezra said quietly, yes. You did not come up here as a frightened girl who happened to also have stolen a ledger. You came up here as the second half of a plan whose first half was already in the United States mail, yes, she said. Jed leaned back in his chair. He looked at her for a long moment. Then very slowly he began to laugh. It was a quiet laugh with no malice in it, the laugh of a man who has been outmaneuvered and is grateful for it. Mrs. Beaumont, he said, you are the most dangerous woman I have ever sat at a table with. I was raised by a man who believed that every soul has two duties, she said. To trust in the providence of God and to act as if providence will not save you from your own carelessness. My father preached that sermon every other autumn. I memorized it. Toby was looking at her with that wonder again. So all this time, he said, all this time we have been thinking we were protecting you, and the truth is that you had already protected yourself before any of us knew your name. I needed protecting too, she said softly. Do not misunderstand me. I would have died on that ridge if Jed had not caught me. I would have died on that table if Ezra had not cut the bullet out. I would have died in the alcove last night if Toby had not given me the shotgun and told me what to do with it. I am not too proud to say that, but I did not come up here helpless, Tobias. I came up here with one half of a plan, hoping I had chosen the right men to be the other half. She looked at the three of them. I had. There was a long quiet. What does this mean for what we do next? Jed asked finally. It means Haname said that we do not have to fight this in the mountains anymore. We have already won the war. We just have to deliver the news. The book in this room and the book in Judge Holloway's safe will, between them, end Cyrus Lockhart's empire. Lockhart himself is already dead. The 15 men he sent are buried in the Widowmaker. What is left is the cleanup, and the cleanup begins with Mary Whitaker. Silas by the stove lifted his head. You said Haname went on that Lockhart was holding your sister under guard. I know his men. I know how they work. The marshal's office has a basement cell that he uses for prisoners he does not want on the official books. That is where she will be. That is where he kept the bank manager's wife for 3 days last spring when he wanted her husband to sign a deed. We have to assume the orders are still standing. We have to assume that as long as no word comes back from these mountains, his men will keep her alive because they will keep waiting. The moment they learn he is dead, she has hours, perhaps less. So we ride before the news rides, Jed said. Yes. How many men does he have at the office? Toby asked Silas. 2 when I was taken, Silas said. Sometimes a third in the evenings. They drink hard. They do not stand watch the way real soldiers stand watch. And there is one more thing Haname said. There is a federal judge living in Helena named Augustus Holloway's nephew, Judge Eli Holloway. He is the only honest judge in that town. 6 weeks ago, he refused to sign a foreclosure order on a widow named Mrs. Tanner. 2 days later, his carriage went off the bridge over Last Chance Gulch. He survived, but with a broken hip. He has been in his bed under his housekeeper's care ever since. The official story is that the horse is spooked. The unofficial story, which I heard at the bank from a clerk who is friendly with the housekeeper, is that the harness had been cut. Lockhart was going to let him heal, then have him killed in his sleep when the talk had died down. We need to get to him. We need to get him out of that house, and we need to put him under our protection until we can move him to Denver. Jed looked at his brothers, so he said, we ride for Helena, we get the girl, we get the judge, we bring them out. From there, it is a clean ride to the Northern Pacific Spur, and a train to Denver where Judge Holloway's nephew can wire his uncle in San Francisco, and the federal warrants can be drawn up against everyone in this book. Yes, Haname said. When Toby asked, tonight, she said. The night before they rode, none of them slept alone. Jed sat in the chair by the door with his Winchester across his lap. Ezra sat in the rocking chair by the window with a book of Psalms open on his knee that he was not really reading. Toby lay on the floor beside the bed with his coat rolled up under his head and his hand resting on the side of the bed frame near hers, but not touching her because she had been raised a Methodist minister's daughter, and they had agreed without ever discussing it that nothing of that kind would happen until vows had been spoken in front of a preacher. Haname lay in the bed with her good hand resting on top of the buffalo robe and looked at the dark ceiling. You do not have to keep watch over me, she said very quietly to the room. We are not keeping watch, Jed said from the door. We are with you. She closed her eyes. She was 24 years old, and she had been alone in the world for 3 years, and she had been alone in a different way for many years before that, and she had not understood until that moment that there was a difference between being watched and being kept company. She slept. The ride to Helena took 3 days. They left the cabin at dawn with 2 pack horses and 3 saddle horses, Silas Whitaker riding behind Ezra because his own legs were not yet steady from his ordeal. Haname rode behind Jed, her good arm wrapped around his waist, her cheek resting against the broad, warm wall of his back. The land rolled out before them white and silver under a hard winter sun, and for long stretches no one spoke. On the second night, they camped in an abandoned line shack on the edge of a frozen creek. Ezra cooked. Toby tended the horses. Silas sat with his back against the wall and stared at the fire as if he were trying to memorize it. Jed and Haname sat together on a fallen log a little apart from the others, and Jed cleaned his Colt while Haname watched the stars come out one by one over the creek. Will you tell me something, she said. Anything. Tell me why you stayed at Pinkerton as long as you did, after the first time the law betrayed you. Tell me why you did not quit then. What kept you trying? Jed thought about it for a long time. The cleaning rag moved slowly along the barrel of the Colt. I was 30 years old, he said finally. I had been a soldier in the war. I had been a deputy in 3 different territories. By the time I came to the Pinkertons, I had already buried more friends than most men ever have. The agency was the first place I had been since the war that felt like it was actually trying to do something. The first 6 years I worked for them, I caught 17 men, murderers, robbers, men who had hurt children. I brought them in. Most of them were tried and sentenced. 2 were not. Those 2 were the ones I remembered. He paused. When the second of those two walked free, I quit. I told my brothers I was done with civilization. I told myself I was going to live somewhere where the cold did not lie about who it was killing. I came up here. I built that cabin. I trapped. I hunted. I stopped shaving. I read the same 6 books over and over. I tried to forget that I had ever believed in anything. He looked at her. It did not work, he said. You cannot forget that you believed in something just because the thing you believed in betrayed you. The belief is its own thing. It does not need the institution. I learned that very slowly over 6 years in a cabin where I did not have to answer to anyone. And then a letter arrived that my brother had written without telling me, and I argued with him about it for a month, and then I signed it because I loved him. And then a tintype came in the mail, and I started to argue with myself about it, and I lost that argument too. And then a woman ran across a frozen creek with a bullet in her back, and I caught her before she hit a rock. And by the time I carried her 3 miles up that ridge to my door, I had remembered what I had spent 6 years trying to forget, which is that I am in the end a man who believes in things. I cannot help it. It is how I was made. Hannah Mae was quiet a long time. What do you believe in now? She asked softly. You, Jed said. The boys. That is enough belief for one man for one lifetime. She did not answer. She leaned her head against his shoulder. After a while, he lifted his arm and put it around her, careful of her wound, and they sat that way until Ezra called them to supper. They reached the outskirts of Helena on the third night well after dark. The town lay in a shallow bowl between hills lit here and there by the yellow squares of windows and the cold blue light of a half moon on snow. They left the horses with a stable hand at the edge of the settlement, a man Silas knew from his father's days who took the coins Jed pressed into his palm and asked no questions. Hannah Mae drew a map in the snow with a stick. The marshal's office sits here on the corner of Main and 6th. The basement is accessed from the alley behind through a coal chute that has not locked properly since I was a clerk. Mary will be in the cell on the south wall. The 2 guards drink in the front room. They will not hear the chute if it is opened slowly. Toby, Ezra, that is your work. She drew another square. Judge Holloway's house is here 2 streets over, stone wall around the garden, kitchen door is the only one without a deadbolt. The housekeeper sleeps in the room above the pantry. Her name is Mrs. Bell. She is loyal to him, and she does not love Lockhart. If we wake her, she will help us. Jed and I will take the judge. Toby studied the map. You should not be the one going for the judge, he said. You can barely lift your arm. I am the only one Mrs. Bell knows by sight, Hannah Mae said. If she sees a stranger in her kitchen, she will scream. If she sees me, she will help. There is no one else who can do this part. Jed nodded. She is right, he said. We move at midnight. We meet behind the livery at 1. If anyone is not there by 1:15, the rest go without them. No one argued with that. At midnight, Jed and Hannah Mae crouched at the back wall of Judge Holloway's garden. The kitchen door, as she had said, gave when Jed put his shoulder gently to it. They stepped into a kitchen that smelled of bread and wood smoke. A single banked fire glowed in the iron stove. Mrs. Bell, Hannah Mae whispered into the dark of the back stairs. There was a long pause, then a voice from above, sharp and afraid. Who is there? It is Hannah Mae Brennan, Mrs. Bell. I worked at the Territorial Bank. We met when you came to settle the judge's accounts last spring. Please come down. A creak, a footfall. A woman in her 60s in a flannel wrapper appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a candle in one hand and a heavy iron poker in the other. Miss Brennan, she said, they told us you were dead. I was not, Hannah Mae said. Mrs. Bell, this is my husband. We have come for the judge. We believe his life is in danger. We believe the carriage was no accident. We need to take him out of this town tonight. Will you help us? Mrs. Bell looked at Jed. She looked at Hannah Mae's bandaged shoulder under the open coat. She looked at the satchel. Thank the Lord, the old woman whispered. Thank the Lord. I have been waiting for someone to come, and I had stopped believing anyone would. Up the stairs, Miss Brennan. Quickly. He sleeps light, the dear man, and he will not be afraid when he sees you. In the alley behind the marshal's office, Toby and Ezra worked the coal chute open in absolute silence. Toby slid down first. The lantern unlit the Colt in his belt. Ezra followed. The basement smelled of coal dust and old stone. They moved along the corridor by feel. They found the cell on the south wall, the iron bars cold under their fingers. Mary Toby whispered into the dark. A small, terrified intake of breath, a rustle of straw. Mary Whitaker, he said again gently. My name is Tobias Beaumont. Your brother Silas is alive. He is waiting for you 1/4 mile from this building. We have come to take you out. A long silence. Then a voice, very young, very tired, very careful. Silas is alive. He is bruised. He is tired. He is thin. He is alive. Then please, sir, take me with you. Toby felt for the lock. It was a simple bolt padlocked. He had brought a slim iron pick. Within 90 seconds, the padlock fell open in his palm, the cell door swung wide, Mary Whitaker stepped out into his arms, and she weighed less than the wolf pelt Jed had been carrying on the day this whole story began. She buried her face in Toby's coat and did not make a sound. Ezra led them back toward the chute. Above them in the front room, a man laughed loudly at some joke another man had told. Glass clinked. None of them were watching. They were halfway up the chute when one of the deputies stood up from his card game to relieve himself in the alley. Ezra heard the back door of the marshal's office open. The boots crunched on the snow 10 feet above them. Mary, Ezra whispered, pressing his hand over the girl's mouth. Mary, do not move, do not breathe. The deputy stood at the alley wall for what felt like a year. He whistled a tune off key. He buttoned his trousers. He shuffled back toward the door. Then he stopped. Then he turned. Then he looked at the coal chute, his mouth open. Toby's Colt came up out of the dark of the chute, and the muzzle caught the lantern light from the alley lamp. And the deputy, who had been a bully and a thief, and probably a worse thing than that, made the only correct decision of his life and turned and ran for the door of the marshal's office, shouting an alarm. Move, Ezra hissed. They came up out of the chute at a scramble, Mary half lifted between them, and they ran. The Helena Street chase lasted 7 minutes by the cathedral clock. To the 4 men and 2 women involved, it was longer than that. The 2 deputies who had been drinking in the front room came out into the alley with their pistols up, and 3 more came running from a saloon across the street where they had been off duty and where the alarm bell of the marshal's office had reached them through a bartender's open back door. 5 deputies. Ezra, Toby, a frail 17-year-old girl who could not run. Toby lifted Mary onto his shoulder and ran for the livery. Ezra dropped to one knee at the corner of an alley. The shotgun braced and emptied the first barrel into the snow at the deputy's feet. He was not trying to kill them. He was trying to make them lose their nerve. 2 of them dove for cover. 2 streets over, Hannah Mae heard the shot. Mrs. Bell had bundled the judge into a nightshirt, a heavy coat, and a fur cap. Jed had lifted the old man, hip and all, into his arms as if he weighed nothing. They came down the kitchen stairs as the shotgun barked again, more distant this time. That is not good, the judge said dryly, awake and surprisingly clear-eyed. Your Honor, Hannah Mae said, I am going to ask you to forgive a great deal of indignity in the next 10 minutes. My dear Miss Brennan, the judge said I have been waiting for indignity for 6 weeks. I welcome it. Mrs. Bell, you are coming with us. I am, said Mrs. Bell, who had already put on her boots. They came out into the alley. Down the next street, a deputy sprinted past the mouth of their alley, not looking sideways, chasing the sound of Ezra's shotgun. Jed waited until he had passed. Then they crossed. By the time Toby reached the livery with Mary on his shoulder, his lungs burning, the stable hand had the 4 horses saddled and ready. Toby lifted Mary onto the back of the gentlest one, a gray gelding, and tied her wrists loosely to the saddle horn so she would not fall if she fainted. Ezra came pounding around the corner. 30 seconds later, the shotgun reloaded. 2 deputies came around the corner behind him. Ezra spun in the saddle and fired both barrels above their heads. The deputies stopped dead, their hats blown off by the pellets, and threw themselves into the snow. Jed and Hannah Mae arrived from the other side. The judge held in front of Jed on his saddle like a child, Mrs. Bell behind Hannah Mae on a borrowed mount, with her arms around Hannah Mae's waist. Are we everyone? Jed shouted. We are everyone, Toby shouted back. Then they rode. They rode south out of Helena under a half moon, the deputies' shouts fading behind them, the cold wind drying the sweat from Toby's neck and Ezra's hands. They rode until the lights of the town were a memory, and then they kept riding. Twice in the night, Hannah Mae thought she would faint from the pain in her shoulder, and twice she did not, because Mrs. Bell was holding her up from behind, and Mrs. Bell, it turned out, was a woman of formidable strength. By dawn, they were 30 miles south at the railhead of the Northern Pacific Spur, where the morning train would carry them to Denver. 3 weeks later, in a federal courtroom in Denver, Judge Augustus Holloway of San Francisco, who had ridden over the mountains in person at the urgent telegram of his nephew, sat at the bench and presided over the opening of an envelope that had been waiting in his court safe for almost 2 months. The ledger inside matched page for page the ledger that Hannah Mae Brennan Beaumont, 24 years of age, late of Helena and of St. Louis, before that surrendered to him in open court. 12 men were indicted within a week. Within 3 months, 8 had been convicted. The land that Cyrus Lockhart had stolen was returned to the families of the murdered ranchers. Silas Whitaker received the deed to his father's farm. Mary Whitaker, sitting beside her brother in the courtroom on the day the verdict was read, was 17 years old and weighed perhaps perhaps 90 pounds, and she did not cry until the gavel came down, and then she cried for 10 minutes, and then she did not cry again for a long time. On the steps of the federal courthouse on the day after the last verdict, a man in a long gray coat was waiting for Jed. "I know you," Jed said. "You should," the man said. "You worked for me for 6 years. We want you back, Caldwell. We want you back with a bigger badge and a better salary and a territory of your own." Jed looked at him. He looked at Hannah Mae, who was standing on the courthouse steps a few yards away with Toby on one side of her and Ezra on the other, talking quietly with Mrs. Bell about a dressmaker. "Tell them," Jed said, "that justice does not live in courthouses." The man in the gray coat raised his eyebrows. That is a strange thing for a man who just won the largest federal case in this territory in 20 years to say. "It is not strange," Jed said. "It is exact. Justice did not live in this courthouse before my wife walked into it. She brought it with her. She brought it in her satchel. When she leaves this afternoon, she will take it with her, and she will carry it back to a cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains, and there it will live with us until we are all in the ground. If you want justice, sir, you go where she goes. The courthouse is just the room where she was kind enough to leave you a copy." He tipped his hat. "Tell them I am not coming back," he said. He walked away from the man in the gray coat. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him in that courthouse worth turning his head for. Everything he wanted was already standing on the steps in the afternoon light, waiting for him to come and take her home. Spring came late to the Bitterroots that year, but when it came all at once. The snow on the lower meadows melted in a single warm week in April. Wildflowers came up through the wet earth in a riot of yellow and blue and white. The creek that ran past the cabin swelled and sang. The horses in the small corral by the barn shed their winter coats in great matted handfuls that Toby gathered patiently and gave to Hannah Mae for the nests she was helping the swallows to build under the eaves of the porch. They were married on the porch of the cabin on the first Sunday in May. A circuit preacher named Reverend Fletcher rode in for the day from the Methodist mission at Fort Lapway, a man Hannah Mae had written to in the winter and who had remembered her father's sermons from an old copy of the Methodist Quarterly. He stood on the top step of the porch in a black coat and read the marriage service for Hannah Mae and Jedediah Beaumont in front of a small congregation that consisted of Ezra, Toby, Silas Whitaker, Mary Whitaker, Mrs. Bell, who had come up from Denver for the occasion, and Judge Eli Holloway, who was walking now with a cane. The Reverend pronounced them husband and wife under the laws of the Idaho Territory and the United States of America. Jed slid a plain gold band onto Hannah Mae's finger. He kissed her briefly with a tenderness that surprised even him. Then the Reverend folded his book, stepped down off the porch, and went to take a long, thoughtful walk along the creek with Mrs. Bell, because he had been told beforehand very gently that what came next was a private matter between four people and their God, and he had agreed because he was that kind of preacher. On the porch, Ezra Beaumont stepped forward. "Hannah Mae," he said, "before God and these mountains, I take you as my wife in spirit and in honor and in the small daily work of a household. I will be at your side as long as you have need of me. I will heal what I can heal in you, and I will sit with what I cannot. You have already brought a part of me back from a graveyard in Pennsylvania that I did not know could come back. There is no ring that can answer that, but I have made you this." He took from his coat pocket a small ring of beaten silver set with a single fragment of green stone. The stone was the same color as the riding habit she had been wearing on the day Jed had caught her. "I cut the stone myself," he said, "from a piece of country agate I found on the ridge above the cabin in February. It is not an emerald. It is what we have. I thought it suited." He slipped the ring onto her finger above the gold band. Tobias Beaumont stepped forward next. "Hannah Mae," he said. His voice was not steady. "I have not had your years in this world, and I do not have my brother's words. I wrote a letter once that you read 11 times. I did not know when I wrote it that I was writing it to you in particular. I know now that I was. I have made you this." He took from his pocket a ring made of plaited horsehair from the manes of all four of the horses they had ridden out of Helena, bound at the joint with a thin band of soft leather. It was clumsy and it was beautiful. "It will not last as long as the others," he said, "but I will make you a new one every spring for as many springs as you give me." He slid it onto her finger above the silver one. Hannah Mae looked down at her hand. 3 rings, 3 men, 1 promise. Hannah Mae, Brennan Beaumont," she said quietly, "take you, Jedediah. I take you, Ezra. I take you, Tobias. I will be your wife in law and in spirit and in the small daily work of a household until death parts us. May God forgive the parts of this he does not approve of, and may he bless the parts he does. Amen." "Amen," said Ezra. "Amen," said Toby. "Amen," said Jed. That night, the cabin was quieter than it had ever been. Ezra went out to sit with Toby on the porch under a sky full of stars. They did not speak. They did not need to. Each had his own silence to keep. Inside in the back room that had been Hannah Mae's sick room in the winter and was now their bedroom, Jed sat on the edge of the bed and waited. Hannah Mae closed the door behind her. She had taken off the green dress. She was wearing a plain white nightdress that Mrs. Bell had brought up from Denver. Her hair was down. She was 24 years old, and she had never been in a bedroom alone with a man before, and she was a little afraid the way a young bride is supposed to be a little afraid, and she was not afraid at all in the deeper place because the man at the edge of the bed was Jed. "I do not know what to do," she said honestly. "I know," he said. He held out his hand. "Come here." She came. He drew her down beside him. He did not rush. He had been a soldier and a detective and a hunter. He had a great many talents. The greatest of them that night was patience. "I will not hurt you," he said quietly. "I will not be in a hurry. We have the rest of our lives." He did not, and he was not, and they did. Spring became summer, summer became fall, fall became winter, and winter in time melted again into spring. 1 year after the wedding, almost to the day, Hannah Mae Brennan Beaumont stood on the porch of the cabin in a loose blue dress with one hand resting on the round, high curve of her belly. She was 6 months along. The baby kicked under her palm whenever she stood still for too long. Mrs. Bell had told her in a letter that this meant a determined child, a child who did not like being ignored. Toby was splitting wood at the chopping block in his shirt sleeves, the sun warm on the back of his neck. Ezra was on his knees in the kitchen garden he had planted for her, thinning rows of carrots and humming under his breath in a key that almost matched the one he had hummed in the Widowmaker on the morning that everything had changed. Jed was coming up the trail from the elk meadow with a yearling buck slung over his shoulder, his stride unhurried, his rifle on his hip, his shadow long on the grass. Mary Whitaker was on the porch with Hannah Mae churning butter. She lived with them 3 months out of the year now, and on Silas's farm the rest, and she was 18 years old, and she had begun to laugh again. It had taken a year. It had been worth waiting for. Jed reached the porch. He set the buck down on the railing. He came up the steps and put his hand on Hannah Mae's belly beside her own and waited until the baby kicked hard enough to push his palm. "There she is," he said. "There he is," Hannah Mae said. "We will know in 3 months," Jed said. He smiled. They had been having the same conversation at varying intervals since February. Toby and Ezra came up to the porch. The four of them stood together in the warm spring sun. The mountains rose around them, gray and blue and white-capped, the same mountains in which 15 men were buried under stone, the same mountains down which a woman in a green dress had once been chased by a marshal's bullet. "Are you happy?" Jed asked her quietly beside her ear. She thought about the question seriously the way her father had taught her to think about every serious question. "I am at peace," she said. "I do not know that happy is a large enough word. I think happy is a word for shorter feelings. I am at peace, Jed. I am where I am supposed to be. I have a household. I have a husband and 2 more men I love. I have a child coming. I have work in front of me for the rest of my life that means something. I do not believe I will ever be unhappy in any way that matters. Happy is too small. I am at peace. That is enough word for me," Jed said. He put his arm around her shoulders, careful of the old wound that still pulled when the weather changed, and they stood that way as the sun moved west. Hannah Mae Brennan Beaumont had been shot in the back while running for her life on a winter day in 1878. She had not fallen. She had been caught. She had been carried up a mountain by a man she had never met into a cabin she had only imagined into the lives of 3 brothers who had been waiting for a wife the way men wait for spring. The minister's daughter from St. Louis had crossed a continent to save 12 names in a stolen ledger and 1 girl in a marshal's basement. She had brought a corrupt empire down with a book and a shotgun and an aunt's old Bible. She had done what no preacher she had ever heard, including her own father, had done from any pulpit. She had saved more souls in the mountains than her father had ever saved from his. The mountains had taken note. The mountains, as her husband had told her once, did not take bribes and did not care who your father was. But the mountains did on occasion recognize their own. Hannah Mae had become, in the only way that mattered, one of theirs. She would live a long life on that porch. She would raise 4 children in the cabin behind her. She would teach 2 of them to read by the light of the same lantern Ezra had used to cut the bullet out of her shoulder. She would learn medicine from Ezra and tracking from Toby, and she would learn slowly over many years to read Jed's silences the way other women read scripture. She would write 3 letters a year to Mrs. Bell in Denver and receive 3 letters a year in return. And when Mrs. Bell finally came to live with them in her old age, age, Hannah May would tend to her until the end as if she were her own mother. She would bury her men in time the way every wife who is given the gift of long years must bury her men. She would not bury them alone. She would have her children and her grandchildren and the mountains and a faith that had been tested in a silver mine and had not broken. But all of that was still ahead of her on the spring afternoon when she stood on the porch with her husband's hand on her belly and her two other men beside her and the mountains rising blue and gray around her home. That afternoon, all she had to do was breathe in and breathe out and feel the child kick and be at peace. And she was.